There was something off about Max as he came back, hopping into view between the pines, and coming to join us on the trail. There was a rigidness to his step, a tension in his body, that made him look like some puppet played by strings. He paused for a moment to glance back over his shoulder and into the woods as if to scan his surroundings, before getting back on track. The rest of the group was mired in conversation and small talk, so no one seemed to notice the oddity of his movements. As he joined the pack, his face was expressionless as he came by my side, and just as silent despite the rocky terrain he had just traversed. Not a huff nor a puff escaped his lungs. I suddenly felt a chill at the back of my neck as our eyes met, and I spoke up with unease. "Max, you all right there, man?" He stood still for a moment, that same blank expression on his face, before a sudden smile drew across it. It was like someone was yanking at the sides of his mouth to force out the smirk. It was strained, and every bit as wrong as his walk had been. He replied, with a voice that seemed to echo within, the movements of his mouth just barely not matching the words that came out. "I'm prime, man. Let's get back to it." "Yeah, prime. Now that's a word you don't hear many say at all outside of math class." I was about to respond when a sudden jerk pushed his body forwards, and he joined the band that got right back on marching, busy talking. No one bothered to do more than glance back and really take a look at him. No one except for me. It was maybe 15 minutes of walking later. Max was silent as he kept pace along the edge of the group, dragging his right foot behind him as he moved with that same jerky and uncanny motion. No one seemed to pay him much attention. As they talked, the conversation flowing from subject to subject as easy as the wind. We came to a halt once again as Josh went into the tree line to take a piss. There was a general chorus of huffing and groaning as he disappeared between the foliage. Only Max kept silent, eyes locked onto Josh, following him with jerky motions of his neck. That was when I thought I heard something from deep in the woods behind me, a sudden rustling in the underbrush as movement cut through the darkness. I could just barely make out some kind of shape moving far off within the woods, illuminated by the occasional rays of moonlight that broke through the canopies. The forest has gone quiet, but for the chatter behind me, nothing but the gentle rush of wind as the birds and insects fell silent. Max was gone by the time I turned back around to see what the boys were up to. Daniel, Jack, Nick, and Logan were all standing side by side, talking about some TV show. I can't recall exactly. Everyone was in their place, but for Max and Josh. I was just about to ask Daniel where Max had gone when another sound came from the tree line, and Josh appeared from behind a boulder. A ray of moonlight was upon his face, so I could see that familiar blank expression that stretched across it. The same jerky motions seemed to pull and push his limbs to and fro as one foot dragged behind. That same unnatural smile drew across his face as he stepped onto the dirt trail and met my gaze. He raised one rigid hand to wave when I heard a whisper in the woods behind me once again. It was Max, standing at the edge of the trail behind me. He, too, had a smile plastered on his face as he stared in my direction. 50 yards behind him, a couple of bushes were rustling at the edge of the tree line. By all accounts, he had traveled that distance in the split second between when I'd heard the noise and when I'd turned around to face him. I was mouthing out a startled hello when he walked past me and joined Nick and Jack, throwing an arm around the ladder as the pack got to walking again. Much of the stiffness had disappeared from his movements, and his words sounded almost natural as he spoke, and I listened in from the side. Yet, he spoke only in yes and no, and his mouth still didn't manage to move quite right when you looked at it for long enough. Josh, on the other hand, was a mirror image of Max from earlier, sudden and jerky in his steps, and dragging a foot behind as he moved, somehow noticed by no one but me. We had already come into view of the campsite a couple of minutes later. I was by Jack's side, eyeing Max and Josh as I walked. The forest had grown quieter still as we had approached the campsite, even the wind seeming to die in the air. The lake lay visible at the side of the trail through a sparse line of willows that marked its shore. It, too, had gone quiet, the gentle sloshing of waves replaced by a surface eerily still, reflecting the full moon like a perfect mirror. The conversation was plentiful, but all I could hear was the sound of Josh pacing a few meters behind me, the sound of his foot dragging across the dirt, It seemed to get closer if I didn't look over my shoulder for long enough. Every time I glanced back, he would be looking away. Every time I looked away, his eyes would whip around and lock right onto my back at the edge of my vision. That damn crooked smile would stretch across his face. When I tried talking to him, he would answer with that echoing voice. Turning away, I tapped Jack on the shoulder, feeling those eyes digging into my back. Hey bro, I dunno if this is, weird to ask, but you think Max has been acting a little strange? He paused for a couple of moments at the question, glancing to his right where Nick, Daniel, and Max were arguing over video game balance. Max seemed mostly silent, looking off into the tree line. Between his short words and nods, Jack replied, "Nah, man, it's not weird, but there isn't really anything wrong with him, I don't think." He turned towards the trio again before continuing, "I dunno, maybe he's walking a little weird, but he, hit his ankle around the pond earlier, right?" Unsatisfied, I nodded and was turning away to face forwards when something caught my eye. It was Max, his dead eyes staring right into my own. I shook my head and quickly looked away. I could feel two sets of eyes watching me as we arrived at the campsite. The fire was blazing in the fire pit. As we held out our marshmallows over the flames, watching them char and melt into the sticks, Josh was sitting in front of me, going back and forth between staring up at the stars and losing his gaze in the fire pit. To my left, there was Max, eating his marshmallow with sudden, fierce bites, as if it was raw meat and not fluffy sugar he was biting into. All around, the boys were tired from a long day's march, huddling around the fire in a cozy and intimate kind of silence, unaware of the strangeness in the air. I broke it by addressing Josh. "Yo dude, you remember that time we snuck a raccoon into the admin's room? When was that?" "It was." I gave a tiny pause, pretending to be trying to remember as I waited to see if he would say something. "It was 2 weeks or something before the midterms, right?" He softly nodded his head yes, looking up from the fire with that creepy smile. I continued, "Who was that guy they pinned it on, anyway?" They said they'd seen him on a security camera snooping around the time of the crime, or some BS like that. I smiled at him between sentences, and he mirrored it, his uncanny smirk widening to match my own, mechanically, as if on a prompt. "What was his name?" "Oh yeah, it was Tony Elkins, that Indiana kid." Giving a forced chuckle, he repeated after me, "Oh yeah, it was Tony Elkins, that Indiana kid." I gave him one last smile before turning away to pretend to look at the lake. Really, I was facing away to hide the fear that I felt creeping up from my stomach and into my face. There had been no raccoon incident, and there certainly hadn't been no Tony Elkins from Indiana. I finally let myself admit the gut-wrenching truth. Whoever was sitting across from me was not my friend Josh, and whatever was pretending to be Max was not really Max. It's strange how mundanely the impossible becomes reality. One moment the world makes sense, simple and ordinary like everyday life. The next, it's all changed. All the while, nothing's really changed. The stars still shine in the night sky, and the ground is still solid beneath your feet. Yet, really, it all has. Suddenly, there's just a little more to everything, a secret to every corner. Suddenly, there's no end to the universe. I caught Josh's eyes staring into me when I turned back, eyes that were like two black holes, piercing through the dancing flame between us. Daniel, Nick, Logan, and Jack were all calmly eating their marshmallows, unthinking and hazy like in a dream. They were talking of games and girls, of schools and jobs. None of them saw the silent panic in my eyes. I then turned my attention towards Max. His marshmallow branch was twisting in his hand in a jagged motion. His fingers were both snappy and completely lethargic in their movements, clumsy like a left hand trying to write. His marshmallow was a melty, gooey ball of sugar as he lifted it straight out of the fire and popped it into his mouth. I'm pretty sure I heard the spit in his mouth sizzle on contact. He made no reaction. Watching him chew on the marshmallow, I noticed that his stubble was gone. His face, shaggy and unkempt mere hours before, suddenly spotless. I looked down to see that his arms were just as bare. In the shine of the flame, I noticed something else that sent shivers down my spine. His skin was wrong. It looked like plastic, pulled taut over his bones. There was matte finish to his flesh, almost sanded over, that was unlike any person that I'd ever seen. His skin was rubber. Despite myself, I reached forward to touch it, my arm trembling, as silence seemed to weigh down on everything. My fingers brushed past his forearm. He felt like spandex against my touch, stretching like gum beneath my hand. Looking up and meeting his gaze, I saw the hollow of his eyes, a darkness in his pupils raging inside, about to burst open into a dark flame. I think I saw a tremor starting on the arm I was touching, something akin to an earthquake approaching from within when Nick interrupted. "Well, you ladies have fun and enjoy the fire. I'm gonna head out and gather some more firewood." Max's arm was pulled away when I turned back around, his eyes suddenly calmed, staring into the stars. I watched Nick slowly walk away from the fire and into the tree line, lit by the summer moonlight. Panic raged through me as I watched him disappear into the woods. In a sudden motion, I grabbed a flashlight and shot up to my feet. "I'm gonna go take a piss, you guys. Try not to miss me too much." The eyes of Josh and Max watched me as I first went behind a boulder at the edge of the campsite, and then followed Nick's entry into the woods. You don't really understand the darkness that lurks within forests at night until you've seen it with your own eyes. Under the cover of the canopies, it starts getting dark the moment the sun descends onto its afternoon arc. The air shifts suddenly as the shadows grow long and crooked. It is practically night around 4 p.m., and it only gets darker from there. By the time the moon is out and shining, the forest is a pitch black that flashlights can scarcely even shine through. The branches of the trees were like a deep ocean as I looked for Nick, swallowing the flashlight's glow so it reached only a few yards ahead. I was following the faint sound of footsteps that echoed from somewhere in front of me. I pursued the noise silently, not daring to call out to my friend, as the weight of the forest silence seemed to bear down on me. I had been walking for maybe only a minute, but it had felt like hours in the maze of the trees. That was when I heard it. "Help!" a voice called out meekly from a clearing that opened up before me. It was Max's voice, repeating that same word over and over again like a broken record, identical each and every time. I approached the edge of the clearing where I saw Nick. He was maybe 15 meters to my left, walking on the grass towards the opposite side of the clearing from where the pleas echoed. "Help!" the voice called out one last time as the pleading came to a stop. The air seemed to hold its breath as the forest skipped a heartbeat, and everything stood in silence. Nick came to a sudden halt in the middle of the clearing, staring, straining his eyes to see something at the edge of the tree line. The quiet stretched on as dread built up in my guts, a hollowness from deep within as my subconscious prepared for something terrible. It was a man in khaki shorts and a red t-shirt that appeared. The moonlight was cast upon his face, its head, really, for it had no face, featureless and smooth like rubber. He had the synthetic no face of a mannequin. He raised an arm, jerking it with the suddenness of a string that had snapped. He waved, so snappy in its motion that it felt like my eyes were skipping frames. He put one leg forward, and then another, moving in a broken motion that could scarcely be considered walking. Nick was frozen in place, as was I, watching the thing approach my friend. 10 yards away, and then 9, 8 yards away, and then maybe only 7. The creature seemed to move in slow motion, an inevitable calamity. It grabbed Nick by the shoulders, as my friend suddenly seemed to break away from his trance. He struggled against the thing's grip, but it was to no avail. It held him in place effortlessly with one hand, clasped over his shoulder like an iron vise. That was when Nick started screaming. They were distorted, horrible shrieks as his shoulder blade crunched between the creature's fingers. His head whipped around frantically, eyes wide with terror as he looked for anything that could help him. His eyes met mine. As his face spun in my direction, he started shouting in between his wails of pain, "Matt, Matt." That was when the creature clasped its other hand over his mouth. His shouting and screaming fell to a muffled murmur as it forced Nick to face itself. He struggled, jerking his head left and right, trying to avoid its gaze. Yet, slowly, the creature made him look. Nick tried to clench his eyes shut for a few moments, hoping against everything that it would all just go away. The thing patiently waited, its no face staring into him. As he finally opened his eyes, I saw a crease forming at the sides of its head then, running from ear to ear, as something shifted underneath its latex skin. The crease slowly opened up as the top and bottom of the mimic's head separated. A gaping maw appeared, revealing an abyss surrounded by rows of iron teeth protruding up from its charcoal gums. That's when Nick started screaming again, his wails growing louder, breaking through the creature's clasped hand. His eyes widened, as did the thing's mouth, growing as large as golf balls in his panic. His legs shook down below and kicked away at the thing, powerless to do anything as its iron grip held him in place. All the while, the thing's mouth just kept widening. It had just about split its head in two when it came to a stop with a springy click. The world, once again, seemed to skip a heartbeat right then. All was silent for a moment like the stars above. Looking into the thing's mouth, I could see that the abyss inside was lit up. It was like the night sky, mesmerizing and infinite, as a billion stars spun in the void. Nick, too, appeared peaceful for a moment as he looked into his killer's maw. That was when the jaws closed. It happened too fast for my eye to register. One moment it was open, and then it wasn't anymore. Nick's body convulsed for a few moments as the creature grinded its teeth against one another, crunching as he chewed through the spine. Nick's limp body met the ground with a hollow thud. A wet sloshing painted the ground as blood poured out from where his head had been. The creature cocked its head back before swallowing Nick. Its throat bulged, stretching like plastic as my friend's head traveled down into its stomach. A few moments had passed when it started convulsing, shivers running up and down its body as it seemed to seize. Its face was blurring, moving and shifting beneath the skin as a face seemed to take shape. First, it was a knot-like nose that rose to the surface, and then two hollows that slowly turned into eyes. Its flesh rippled in waves, as its clothes, too, changed shape in oscillations of color like a chameleon. It took only a minute, and then it was done. It had become Nick. It shuddered one last time, skin bulging and collapsing before he settled into its final shape. It got to walking then, startling me out of the horrified trance I had fallen into. I stumbled back and fell into a bed of bushes, my heart skipping a beat as the rustling of the leaves blew past the silence. I saw my friend's face whip in my direction. It took a couple of rigid paces forward, pausing by an old, weathered-looking pine trunk. The moonlight was cast from behind him, hiding his face in shadows as I looked at him through the leaves. He paused for a moment, or maybe an hour, it was hard to tell. My heart beat against my chest like a hammer as the blood echoes against my eardrums. I clenched my eyes shut, preparing to feel its death grip grab me by the shoulder when I heard his feet shift. His neck jerked around, and his legs started leading him back to our campsite. Nick's headless body lay against the ground, slowly gushing blood through his esophagus. It dangled with the steady flow of the blood shining underneath the moonlight. It was only Max and Nick around the fire. By the time I mustered up the courage to find my way back to the campsite, their faces were cast in shifting shades of orange and red, the flames dancing in the reflection of their eyes. Max was sitting on a cooler with a log to his side, and on the log, the key to Daniel's pickup truck. He seemed even livelier than before, tossing and catching a marshmallow in the air as I approached and sat on a log to his side. He greeted me jovially. "Matt, my man, how long you been pissing for, dude? You got prostate cancer or something?" He laughed at his own joke, catching the marshmallow before popping it into his mouth. He smiled as he chewed on it, and I gave him a meek nod. As I looked at him then, all I could see were those jaws closing around Nick's neck. Looking over the fire at his mimic, I could almost see how its body would look with its head missing, how the blood would be gushing, shining crimson in the firelight. Forcing myself to look away, I swallowed hard before turning towards Max and speaking up. "So, where's everyone gone, man? They ain't gotten snatched up by some Sasquatch." I hope the forced chuckle felt horrible as it came out of my mouth, leaving me feeling exposed on all sides. These things weren't stupid, right? They must have known that I knew. They were just toying with me, leading me along until a jaw would suddenly close around my neck. Matching my chuckle, Max laughed. "Nah, man, Josh just took them out to gather firewood." He looked over to Nick. "Big guy over here apparently came up with nothing." Nick looked up from the fire, his face stretched with that uncanny smile. "Yeah, man, my bad. They'll find some for sure." The silence hung in the air again as chilly winds washed ashore from the lake. Staring into the fire, I could see them eyeing one another with furtive looks. In between the cracks of the fire, I thought I could hear silent mutterings coming from their mouths. strange clicking sounds unlike any human language. I felt exposed like a lone tree atop a windswept hill, death blowing around me with the wind, surrounding me from every angle. The firelight was shining on the metal of the keychain, dancing and tempting. Fear felt tight at the back of my throat like a scream that wanted to escape. I pushed it down and got onto my feet. I'm gonna get myself a Coke from the car. You guys want anything or not? Nick's head snapped up as I walked behind Max, eyeing the keys to his side. I was reaching down to get them when I felt him grip my arm. He was looking up at me, face split between the flames and the shadows of the night. The smile on his face had none of the uncanniness it had had before. The inhumanity of it was replaced by an evil that felt much too human instead. He spoke, "Why don't you sit down, Matty boy?" His hand felt like iron around my wrist as he dragged me back down to my seat. Nick was sitting upright on his log, as straight as an arrow, as he watched with a hunger that could have devoured worlds whole. I let out a long sigh, a sudden upwell of emotions rising from deep within me. Tears slowly trickled down my face as I looked back up to meet Max's hollow eyes. "You aren't gonna let me go, are you?" That's when I saw a crease forming at the edge of his mouth, stretching from ear to ear, as his face started to blur. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see the same thing happening to my right. I had pretty much resigned myself to my fate when I saw it. A single red axe dug into a log between me and Nick. The fire shined upon its silver edge as it glowed as my last hope. The stars were showing between Max's teeth, already a fractal painting of nebulae and the plane of the galaxy. I felt almost at ease then, staring into that death. I thought of the late nights I would spend on the roof of my grandfather's farmhouse. I remembered how peaceful the wind had been, brushing past my face like the comets did the sky. For a moment, death felt like coming home. It was a metallic click that broke me out of my trance as Max's head snapped back. With a courage that seemed to swell out of thin air, I lunged for the axe and felt the handle between my hands. The world fell to silence. All I knew was the wood against my palm as the weight of the metal rushed through the air. The world seemed to spin, the wind rushing past as the axe met my foe. With a loud crunch, the blade lodged itself into Max's neck. A black, tar-like liquid rushed out of the wound as I let go of the weapon, and it swayed in the air, sticking out of the dark flesh. His gaping maw slowly closed as his body fell off of the log and met the ground with a thud. The black blood pooled on the ground and flowed against his face as he lay dead, his blank expression double with its reflection upon the liquid surface. Sound slowly returned to the world as I turned away. The wind suddenly seemed loud as it blew by my ears and carried with it the death stench of the newly felled corpse. The axe suddenly felt as light as a feather in my hand as adrenaline finally caught on to what was happening and rushed through my veins. My heart was beating against my chest so hard I could feel veins bulging in my neck. Nick was to my right, frozen mid-bite as it realized what had just happened. With a sudden clicking sound, his plastic skin undulated, his body shaking as he lunged up at me. His hand struck just a few inches from my leg, biting into a log, crushing the wood like it had been made from cardboard. Jumping away, I yanked the axe free from the mimic's corpse and raised it over my head, bringing it down on his elbow. It broke clean off with a crunch as black liquid gushed from the newly formed stump. The clicking sound from before turned into an animal wailing that threatened to bust my eardrums. His sawed-off hand was still moving, dragging itself across the first in my direction, leaving a trail of black in its wake. Stepping backwards, I squashed it like a bug as the mimic won once again. It whipped through the air, scraping by my torso, marking my back with a dark, burning wound. I brought the axe down on its shoulder, separating its good arm from its body. Its wound seemed to squirm as its muscle fibers slithered over one another like dark worms. The creature lunged again, blood spraying from its gaping wounds. A streak of it hit my face as he swung the stump in my direction. I caught it midair, with a swing of the axe, connecting to its torso with a wet thud. He collapsed on top of me as we came tumbling down on the grass, yanking the axe free from its chest. I shoved it beneath its jaw, ramming the handle across its throat as jaws tried to bite down. Gone was the night sky between them, only the abyss remaining in the mimic's mouth. Despite its two missing hands, the creature's strength was immense, and its jaws were creeping closer and closer to my face, its drool dropping down on my face burning my skin on contact. Jerking its head downwards, it bit off the tip of my nose, tearing it away in an instant with its jagged teeth. The pain was blinding, nearly breaking my grip on the handle. Holding the axe with one arm against the creature's onslaught, I reached out with my right hand in desperation, grasping for anything that could save me. I could feel its breath, like death itself, wafting down from its mouth, stinging my eyes as its mouth opened and closed inches from my face, and my hand found purchase on a rock. With the last of my strength, I brought it to the mimic's head, ramming it against its head over and over again. Wet thuds gave way to a hollow banging which slowly turned to crunches as I cracked its skull. Its maw was wide open, wrapped around my head at last, a split second from closing around my face when my final blow brought it down to the ground. I laid there for a few moments before the growing pool of its dark blood touched my face and jolted me upright, burning like acid. Both mimics lay dead by my side, soaked in blood, shining with the light of the dying flame. The adrenaline had mostly worn off. By the time I got to the car, it was a strange calm driving through the pines, with death mere minutes in my past. It was maybe an hour later that I'd reached the edge of the national park. That's when it all came back crashing down. I got out of the car and fell down onto the dirt, clutching my stomach as its contents spilled on the road. I fell away from my sick and collapsed on the ground by the pickup's side. The crunch of bones as the axe had met the creatures, the sound of flesh tearing as the mimic chewed on Nick's neck, that damned smile as Max came back from the woods and joined us on the trail. It all played through my mind at 100 miles an hour as I lay down, looking up at the stars. Despite everything that had happened, they shined on like they always had and always would, silent and eternal in their celestial seats. I laid there for maybe half an hour, letting the night sky calm me before a sound from the forest woke me back up. I listened in close, looking deep into that forest that held death inside. Meek sounding and seeming to echo, it was a help that came from between the pines. A moment later, the sound was multiplied all around me as the forest boomed with noise. Staggering back to the pickup, I grabbed a flashlight from the passenger seat. Slowly, I shined it across the tree line. There were hundreds of them, standing at the edge of the forest. Their no faces shined smooth with the light as my trembling hands led the flashlight from left to right. Their arms shot up to their sides, waving all in unison. They took a step forward, creeping closer from all directions. When I ran back into the car, I heard their steps coming closer and closer as I fumbled with the keys against the ignition. I pressed down on the gas with all my might as the engine roared to life. I drove away, on, and on that night, the sun was poking up from between the mountains. As I pulled into a motel, I had survived. It's been years now that this tale has been in my past. Sometimes I'll see something out of the corner of my eye. As I'm driving on the interstate, maybe a meek voice from between the pines. Maybe it'll be just in my head, but I'll know to look away and drive on. If there's anything you take away from this tale, let it be just that. If, for whatever reason, you should find yourself face to face with something without a face, asking for help, don't be a good Samaritan. Just walk on and away. Walk on and you may just live to tell the tale.